My brothers and sisters, thank you again for coming to our most recent Lenten lecture. Tonight we're very pleased to have with us our very own Rachel Brazier. As you all know, she's a PhD student over at Eastman School of Music. She has contributed to this community tremendously, revamping and reorganizing our children's choir and breathing fresh life into our Trinity Day services. Rachel has done extensive studies, not only our own chant tradition, but the place and role of women within that chant tradition, the intersection between our music and our spirituality. She knows, she believes, and she's experienced that our music is so much more than a performance that we do, but it changes and touches our very being and unites us in a very literal and physical way. And so she is going to share with us some of her own insights tonight, some of her own research, and it is my very great pleasure to have her here, and I'm very much looking forward to everything that I'm going to learn from you. So Rachel, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for letting me talk to you, and when Father said you should do this, I said, really? And he said, yes, you should. So I have many, many years, almost 15 at this point, of field work. I should say 17 now. I'm getting older and forgetting that. I have 17 years of fieldwork experience in Orthodox music. So I was an opera major. This is my introduction, and then we'll get to the business of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I was an opera major, studying in the 90s.
Were you a singer?
I'm a contralto. I'm in the basement. I was singing Puccini and doing all that stuff and performing. And then I'd been brought up Protestant, and I wasn't very happy with the church I grew up in, where women were seen and not heard, and my ear got twisted a lot, really. And I just was, and you know how much I say my opinion, right? So this was not welcome in some places. And instruments were not okay in any way, shape, or form, not even outside the church. It was a very strict old tradition. My grandfather's a deacon, and so I'd grown up like really raised in the church, and knew my scriptures and all that. Went off to college and ended up cantering for the Roman Catholic Church because I had done my history and worked my way backwards through the schisms, about to the Catholic Church. And I did that for almost 2 years. Learned all of it, and the priest kept saying, "Are you ever going to become Catholic?" And I kept going, "No." I'm like, "It's close, but not quite. I don't know what I'm going to do." So I was in this limbo state for almost 2 years of my life, till a friend needed a ride to an Easter service at midnight. I didn't know what was going on, and I'd never heard of this church, and I was the only one with a car. So I said, "Sure, why not? I'll drive you." And it was funny, he had to call his mother, like, over in Europe to see if it was okay if I wore sandals. He wasn't sure. He's like, "I know you have to have a skirt. Not sure about shoes. Can you wear sandals?" It was very funny. You know, young people, right? So I go walk into this church, and I walk in for Anastasia. I've never seen an Orthodox church in my life. I walk in for Anastasia, and that was it. I never left. I walked in, and it was not just the look of it, but I have to be honest, I was a musician, right? It was the music. It knocked my socks off. I felt like I walked into home. See what I described? It was 1 minute I was there, and that was it. I have talked to our good friend Jacob about this, and he had a very similar experience. I have talked to 5 or 6 other people I know. I think the count is close to 20 now. We keep laughing at ourselves. We're the music converts. And it's not that we converted only because of the music, but the music was the way we got there. It was like Father... Bishop Callisto Square, Timothy Ware's books talk about how, you know, the liturgy is always going on in heaven, and on Sundays we just plug in, and then we unplug in, and I think music is the chord for me, and for a lot of people. So I don't think of music as a performance in the church, at all. I think of music as a conduit, sort of like we burn incense, we burn the candle's a static object until we burn it, right? Well, the prayers are meant to be sung. Father Ephraim Lash of blessed memory, who just passed, was a linguist, who I was privileged to meet twice. He was very funny because whenever we get to arguing about translation things, he'd just get up and say, "I'm going to go talk to the birds about it while you all argue." And he was very calm. So I would often just go hang out with him when it was all a lot of turmoil. And I was the young person trying to learn from all these older people. And he was the one who would say, "You know, when I translate the words, I'm not sure they're going to be right until I hear them chanted. Once they're sung, then I know if they're going to be right or if I have to fix them." The words are meant to be prayed through chanting, and they're meant to be chanted by everybody. So even if you can't chant beautifully, you should be chanting along in the pew. It should not be like the goal of the chanter or the choir or whoever's leading should be to get everybody to chant. So I got to thinking about this. This was like and that was 2003. So I became Orthodox in 99, that was 2003. This was my formational period. I went out to summer institutes at Holy Cross and hung out with like Tyke Zess and all these really great people that were music people, and that's where I met Father Lash. And so I came home and I went, what's going on here? There's more to this music. This is not like Western music. There's more to this than the notes on the page. What's going on? So I started this quest of field work, and I would go to the monastery, the women's monastery in Wisconsin, and I went to about 6 churches, which I included in this big project, and I would take my little recorder in my pocket and make like clandestine recordings, and then go home and transcribe all this stuff out. This is how this all started. So I'd write down everything and try to figure it out, and then I had a group of young women that got together, and we started chanting it for fun. And 2 of them were priest daughters, so we started chanting at people's weddings. And then we got some men to join us, and we had these like all-night chant-a-thons till 2 in the morning. We were 20, you know, we had energy. We'd stay up all night, eat, and chant. And we got really hooked on this music, and we were like, what is it that's causing all these people who aren't Orthodox to be drawn to this chant? And what is it about the kids who were kind of, I don't know how to say this, but like bored with their orthodoxy, that are now 20 years old and in college, that were getting reinvigorated through chant? This is an amazing phenomenon, that music can do this. So this thesis, which is published and is 100 pages, I will not go through the whole thing, I promise, is one of 2 theses that I have written on the subject. This is my musicology thesis, the first one. The second one is an ethnomusicology thesis, which is actually, I decided not to talk about because it's pretty much based on this church and what's happened here. I called it Soma Christou, that we all become one body through chanting together, which I talk about all the time. That it's through chanting together that we physically interact with each other, and we plug into each other as well as, you know, into the liturgy that's going on in heaven. So I want to share with you the top hits from this first musicology thesis, and I want you to understand that this was 15 years of research, and it was before I met all of you. So if you see stories in here and they ring a bell, they will. They're not about you, they're about people in Chicago and Wisconsin. So we're the same everywhere, and that's a good thing. That gives me hope that Orthodoxy is the same but different everywhere, if that makes sense. So maybe in different languages, and that is part of our beauty, right? But yet there's tenets that hold us together. That's what makes us Orthodox. So I'm going to jump through my thesis and hit some major points, and the reason you have handouts is when I get to those, I'll highlight what they are. But these are the things that I then took and have turned into separate studies. So yes, I read and write too much. I spend a lot of time with this. But I thought we might want a brief history of women chanting in the Orthodox Church, and I apologize to the men in the audience, but I think you'll get a lot out of this too. I picked women as a topic because people don't normally look at women hymnographers and the hymns about women saints, and they illustrate some really interesting concepts. There's actually been quite a bit written about particular saints and their hymns, and the major male hymnographers, but very little has been done on the history of women singing in the church. So I'm going to read just a little and I'll come back. During late antiquity in Byzantium, following the legalization of Christianity in 312 AD by Emperor Constantine, there was a desire by church leaders to take both biblical stories and what they called, quote, right belief, which was achieved through writing and performance of hymns and homilies and combine them. There were also written commentaries aimed at the mostly male scholars of the time, but the hymns and the homilies were intended to be more exciting and engaging to the everyday listener. In these are found both the voices and stories of men and women. And the stories of women and how they perceived what it meant to be feminine within the structure of the Orthodox Church. It's embedded in the hymnology about women and hymns by women. People of every gender and age and status were integrated into church through hymns. It was their ability to aid and relate to the stories they were hearing as they saw themselves and their experiences reflected in hymn subjects. So women in American Orthodox churches, right, we chant and sing in choirs, often beginning in youth. This practice is paramount to the internal survival of the history of the church. If there were no women singing in churches, I don't think that the tradition would get past the way it has. That's what I've heard. Many women, these are all based on interviews with people. People have told me, my mother passed this on to me, or my aunt, or this is how I grew up being drugged to choir, right? I stood next to my mother while she chanted or sang. The important traditions and teachings of the church are all immortalized in her hymns. Monasteries, which are important places of access to and dissemination of hymnography, have begun to increasingly and rapidly increase in America. So this means we have more hymnography available to us than we did before. The first North American monastery for women was established in Springfield, Vermont in 1915. I didn't realize it went back that far. There are currently at least 31 Orthodox monastery communities for women in the U.S., These female monasteries are repositories for large amounts of music. They have huge music libraries, and they're suitable for chanting by the all-female choirs of these monasteries. Some have also begun to teach courses on how to read the Byzantine chant notation for young girls and women, so they can go to the monastery and learn. That's how I originally learned to read chant notation. The point of those, though, is not to get the young women to come and chant. The point of it is to teach the stories and the hymnology and the theology of the church to these young women in an early age, so they use the music as a vehicle for teaching. Increasingly, women congregate at women's monasteries to participate in services, and this was a Chicago phenomenon. I will say this. There was this huge monastery in Wisconsin, and there are like 36 Greek churches in Chicago, and on a Friday night for Akathist, like, it was swamped. You couldn't even get into the parking lot of the monastery. And people would take their kids out of school and drive up and spend half the day on Friday. It was a thing. So increasingly, women participate in these services, and it's at the women's monasteries, as well as in churches, that parishioners get introduced to hymns that highlight women in the liturgical music of the church, including one of the most important and most beloved, the Akathist hymn to the Mother of God. And if you take a look at the icon I gave you, the reason I included this is while we have an icon we use, this is the traditional Akathist icon. If you notice around the border is the Greek alphabet, and there's a little icon for each that stands for each verse in the hymn that we sing. So we'll get back to that. So the Akathist hymn is of personal significance to most individual worshipers and to me. It's awfully well attended in the United States, somewhat more so than Europe, from what I've been told in interviews. Women in the Orthodox Church attribute much to this service. They ask the Mother of God's intercession from her Son for many things, including help, salvation in distress, and a lot of people talked about protection for their children. I interviewed close to 200 people as part of this project. So this is where I'm getting all these ideas. I would interview them and just code for themes, like what are people saying they go to the service for? And the biggest one was protection for their children, which I think is really special. Recent practice in some American churches has been for mothers to aid teachers in assisting their children learning this hymn. The children then chant this hymn without the aid of any mature voices on the 5 Fridays of Great Lent. During Holy Friday, the girls that follow the tomb during the Lamentations take their selections for this honor very seriously. They dress and behave with more decorum than if they were asked to be in a family wedding. It's like being a flower girl, right? The hymn of Cassiani, sung on Holy Tuesday evening in anticipation of Holy Wednesday morning, is another service that parishioners in American Orthodox churches make plans to attend. They often decide, this is not true here, but in Chicago they would often decide which language they want to hear it in and try to coordinate which parish they were going to hear it in Spanish or English, Greek or English, sorry. And I know people that would like take off early from work to go and hear these, so the whole family could go together. It was often a tradition that Yaya would take the children to this service, and I find that really fascinating. So these are just a few of the services that give you an idea of the involvement of the Byzantine chant. The characteristics unique to Byzantine chant allow it to effectively serve as a container for the collective knowledge of our church. It helps us collect our ideas, and it helps with retention, right, and transmission. So this is why it's so important. We take the ideas that we hold dear in the Orthodox Church, we put it into our hymns, we transmit it to the next generation, and we work on our own retention of it for a whole life. I mean, how many times do you learn a hymn and that's how you learn the prayer, right? We're all nodding because this makes sense, right? You can't learn the words without the music as well. It doesn't become a part of you in the same way. So it's commonly accepted that theology, history, and spirituality are conveyed through Byzantine chant. But I also suggest in this writing, I have 3 writings on this, that Byzantine chant embeds meanings that include cultural group history of what it means to be Greek Orthodox, specifically in America. There's this identity, there's a belongingness, and there's also gender identity. We talk about him and her in the hymns. We in the Akathist, we specifically refer in first person to the Mother of God. That's very different than the rest of the time we talk about her in third person. In addition, I also looked at how Byzantine chant was a methodological tool. So I looked at how it constructs and teaches us about our role in the church. So through the hymn, I can identify with a particular saint or multiple particular saints and look at how I should behave. How should I identify and teach myself to be listening to these hymns? Does that make some sense? Okay. So now I'm going to skip ahead and all the boring methodology and all those things like that, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call holding her creator. I like to name all my titles hymn lines. So in the Akathist hymn, it talks about she's holding her creator. It's the first incarnation of the Trinity. It's the first time that we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit actually existing, because Christ is incarnate in her womb. This is all in one hymn. This is a package through which we can deliver this idea to people, right? I mean, I know you all know this, but yet I find this very inspiring that you can find a container for this kind of awesome, amazing thought. So the main purpose here is to give you an overview of the chronological development of Byzantine chant. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Some of you may know this already, but I'm going to briefly try to go through it. And I want to show you how the structure of the modes is currently in use, because this matters. We, in American churches, because I said this yesterday, we don't do this as a full-time job. So therefore, we can't do a different mode each week. But in ideal practice, we change the tone hymn each week. We should be doing first mode this week, second mode, and so on, and rotating through the 8 modes. Why? Anybody have any ideas? Why should we rotate through the 8 modes?
It's more interesting.
It is more interesting, that's a good point.
People don't get bored.
Yeah, you're right, and that actually triggers retention. If it was the same every week, you don't retain it. It's like if you tell a kid to do something 6 times, they start to tune you out. But when it changes, it aids retention. It's the same idea, packaged a little differently. The other thing is they talk about the modes having flavor. There originally were 36 Byzantine modes. So in the West, we have major and minor, right? In ancient Byzantium, they had 36 modes in the entire scale set or theoretical scale set. When the church fathers decided to put it in the hymnography, they picked these 8 as the ones that had the, I'm going to say the word flavor. I've heard it translated different ways, but I think flavor fits it the best. They had this quality, this intrinsic quality of being the right feel for church and for the right reason. And so some were brighter than others, and then some were like varis, which is the third plagal or grave tone is what it's called. It's deep and it's repentant, right? It's right before the end, and then you get back to 8th, and then on Pascha we're always back to tone 1, right? Back to the bright. So each tone had a flavor. And Christmas we always end up with tone 1 too. There's a reason for this. There's a plan, and it's that you're supposed to cycle through life, right? There should be a cycle of weeks that are upbeat and weeks that are more introspective. And that was the reason for all of that. It's not just haphazard. It doesn't just rotate by 8 for no reason. So there are things about Byzantine music that distinguish it from concepts in Western music. And I know most of you have been trained in Western music. So what I thought I might do is offer this brief overview, like from the perspective of a Western musician, so you can kind of wrap your brain around it a little bit. So, forgive me, I got lost. And amongst this history, I'm going to include a little bit of information about hymnographers and hymn subjects and chanters who've helped to archive church history. We have this great archive of music, and how that helped to teach and shape the gender ideals of women and men being equal, but having very different roles in the church. And a lot of it is taught through the hymnography. So the modern Byzantine music system uses scales that are called Oriental in origin by the West, or style. That doesn't mean Asia, it means East, if you think about it from a Western viewpoint. They were developed in the Roman Empire. They most likely have roots, we think, in Egypt or Syria, if we look at where it came from. A lot of music came out of Syria. Women's choirs originated in Syria. Byzantine music, or psalmic chant, as it is called by many psaltis, is the main liturgical vehicle of communication in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Services are entirely sung, right? So they follow this prescribed pattern that changes with the year, with the season, with the date. There's this cycle. No 2 services are ever going to follow the exact same order because of substitutions and feast days, but there's this system of patterns that dates back to the music's roots. The Eastern Orthodox Church uses 8 tones or modes in liturgical practice. Those rotate each week, along with the hymn and the resurrection each Sunday. But in common practice now in Divine Liturgy, we use them for Divine Liturgy, Vespers, Orthros, Paraclesis, and the Service of the Hours is really when we rotate mostly now. What happens is on Saturday night, as the sun goes down, and we're doing our Vesper service, that's when we change the mode, because it's now the new week. And so that's preparing us for the little resurrection each Sunday, and that's what's exciting about the new mode change. Those 8 tones are called the octoikos, and they were arranged according to specific rules set down by St. John of Damascus in the 8th century. So the melodic origin of these tones has roots in the ancient popular music of Greece and of Asia Minor. So you'll hear a lot of that and you think, why does this music sound like it belongs in Asia Minor? That's where the theory system comes from. So though Byzantine music started to be written as it is written today in the 11th century, there were additional practices in the 14th century. They kind of streamlined the Byzantine music and made it less complicated, if you can imagine that. But in the 19th century, it was standardized, which is funny because it's exactly what happened in the West. The chant system was standardized about the same time in the East and West developmentally. So the notes we're singing now are equally as old in their system as are the Byzantine notation. They sort of just developed separately. According to Stan Takis, who I think some of you know, Nancy is his wife, she's a chanter. Compared to Western scales and modes, he says Byzantine tones are an entire musical system based on distinct and unique premises. They don't fit inside Western notes, right? We all know this. We try to sing something in Byzantine music, and we need like something that's between the sharp and the flat, and we can't find this, right? And this is what's exciting and different about Byzantine music. So Byzantine music theory is melodically based. There are modal melodies called automelia, which are memorized by the psaltis, usually. That's what you'll hear the person sing it. And then you have the prosomia, the other hymns that are then chanted to the tune of the model, right? Occasionally, idomelia are heard. Those are the set of hymns that have unique melodies, so that you have these separate sets.
Idiomela?
Say it again, please.
Idiomela?
Idiomela. I'm saying it wrong. Thank you. The meter of the music correlates to the meter of the poetry. So the point of Byzantine music is text painting. The words are supposed to drive where the notes go. If we're talking about heaven, it should go up. If we're talking about sin, it should sound crunchy. I can't find a better word for it, but it's text painting to the max. The meter follows the poetry. The group patterns of accented and unaccented syllables can change slightly to help with this word painting, to trick us. So that's why for someone who sings in Greek, it's really difficult when they first hear something in English because it doesn't feel right. It feels like your socks are on the wrong foot or something. And it's because the poetry makes so much sense with the Byzantine line. And when we try to take the melodic line of the Greek, that's an exciting voice. We take the melodic line that fits the Greek and we just shove English in there. It feels weird. But we can't really rewrite it because that tune means so much to us. And that's something else. The tune itself can be, you'll hum the tune to yourself and you'll recall the entire idea, right? So you can't just drop the hymn. I mean, pick a hymn. Ton Saronsu, right? We know when we hear da 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 da, you don't have to have me tell you what that's about. The whole image pops in your head, all of the sound, if you've grown up singing it, right? But if not, it doesn't fit. So, based on the cultural belief that the ancients thought music was not benign, they thought it affected you physically. They chose these modes and tones to fit with musical practice. They only picked 8 of the original ones, ihoi, the church fathers did, and Byzantine modes are similar to Western scales in how they function, but they sound different for a reason. Does that make some sense what I'm getting at? So they were picked purposefully to sound like that. So just trying to fit them into major or minor kind of defeats the purpose. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, is how I put it. So like, let's say you look at the Ages Initiative site. In Byzantine music and Western music, I can look at both of them side by side, and they look very similar. But when I listen to them, the Byzantine music gives me a little more flavor and can start at any pitch. It doesn't matter what pitch you start on. So that means it's facilitating flow, wherever the priest, wherever he comes from, where you pick up and go. So cosmologically, in the worldview of the Orthodox Church, wherever the priest is, you join him and you continue along, and it's about being in the right tone and following the text more than it is about being exactly right on each pitch and each rhythm. So that's really difficult, and so we try to translate it into Western notation. Now, I'm not opposed to Western notation. I use it quite often to chant, but I use it as like a structure or a framework. And I kind of, if you think of it like a coat rack, you kind of hang or drape the coat over it. It's sort of like a dress form, and you just kind of put the sound around it. So you kind of start to learn what the Byzantine tones sound like, and then you can use that as a crutch for yourself. But keep in mind that these tones have particular character and color. Does that make some sense? Okay, so in the West we have a fixed note system, and in the Byzantine music we have no fixed note system. Why would that make sense, besides just picking up where the priest left off? Why theologically would it make sense for us to not have a fixed note system?
Everybody's individual, and so different individuals that come at it from a different...
Correct, and so you have all these different groups, and we often chanted antiphonally. I mean, in the early church, men stood in front of the icon of Christ and women stood in front of the icon of Panagia, and that was the way it was, and I've seen churches where the kids run back and forth. It's kind of funny, but the point was, they would say to the people, go join the choir. They meant go stand out with the people and sing. Everybody sang, right? So there's this antiphonal thing happening, even though there was a leader. You know, in the great church in Constantinople, there was a leader, but everybody sang with him or her. I think in the church in Constantinople that it was a male psalty for the most part, but we have some evidence that there was a daughter of one of the psalties that wrote music, so we're not sure about that. So there are 4 plagal tones. They're cousins. So tones 1 through 4 are like tones 1 through 4. The next 4 tones are their cousins. So tone 5, or plagal first, relates to tone 1, right? There's a reason for that. That way when you flip back and forth, let's say you're in a service and you're in tone 1 and they want to add some color and remind you of tone 1, but yet you're wanting to keep it more penitent, for example, then you might go into plagal 1. Does that make?
What does plagal mean?
It's just a Byzantine music term. It just means it's a scale, a series of sharps and flats, and how you flat sharp things. Yeah. What? Next to. So it literally does mean relative.
On the side of.
On the side? Oh, see?
On the side of.
We love this.
So the 5th is on the side of the 1st.
Right.
So,
And so what it is it shares there's a lower tetrachord and upper tetrachord, the sets of notes, and one of those is shared between the cousins. So it's like half the scale belongs to both. So it's sort of like being related to somebody. You have half the same DNA as them. How do I think of it?
and it's easy for us to slide from one to the other. Sometimes.
Yes, it helps you move between. Dennis.
So tone 2 is 7, tone 3 is 8.
No.
One is 5,
26.
2 is 6, 3 is varies or 7, and 4 is 8. And I have the whole thing written out here. The first 4 tones, are the authentic ones, the 1 through 4. Alpha, the first tone, has a minor feel to it. It has what we call a D final, if you think of it on the piano. So it sounds kind of like Dorian, but yet it starts on G. So I have this all written out for Western musicians if you're ever interested. I won't read it all to you, you'd be bored. There's like 2 pages of it. But it's the idea that you can play this on the piano, sort of, but then I say things like, you have to think of like, 3rd tone is an inharmonic scale, so that means the tuning sounds like F major, but the finale, so the last tone is F, but the drone harmony bounces between F and C, that gives it its color. And I just picked notes from the Western scale to help you conceptualize it. So I won't go into it because it's kind of boring if you are not a singer and don't read music. But what's important are things like varis ends on a low B, if you think of it that way. Like a varis, this grave tone, has this grave-like feel, and then you come back to tone 1 and 2 weeks later and it's back to happy again. So, hymnographers. This is the most interesting part of all this. I found so much stuff I had no idea about. 3 individuals produce the majority of our liturgical music in terms of prose and melodic ideas. Do you know who they are? The 3 main hymnographers in the Orthodox Church? Romanos the Melodist, another guy, St. John of Damascus, and Cassiani. Those are the top 3. So one of the top 3 hymnographers in terms of amount of our hymns was a woman. I found that surprising. They were all monastics, and they were all writing for voices of a single gender. So St. John of Damascus and St. Romanos were writing for men, and Cassiani was writing for women. Cassia is widely considered to be the woman who made the single largest contribution to Orthodox music. She wrote more than the other 2. She's the only woman whose hymns are included in our ecclesiastical books. She lived in the Byzantine Empire in the 9th century, during the last years of the conflict between the iconoclasts and the iconodules. So during this horribly violent period, there were a large number of zealots who were backed by the emperor, we all know this, right, to destroy the religious images. And the iconodules fought the icons, and that victory is historically attributed theologically to the women of the church, including St. Cassia, who wrote about this and tried to fight for our icons to be restored. So this has been historically attributed to their writings and hymns and propaganda, I guess is the right way to put it, towards icons to belong in the church. So she was born about 810 AD. She was a really well-educated woman. Do you know the story of her life? She offended the emperor.
We know about the
Oh, the song, well, that's,
with Theophilus, wasn't his name Theophilus?
yes, that's right, yes. So Emperor Theophilus had put her, it was a beauty pageant actually. So she's this well-educated woman in 810, and her dad wants her to go in this beauty pageant and marry the emperor. So Emperor Theophilus said things to her, and she didn't really want to marry him. She thought he was no good. He was not religious enough for her, and she wanted to go to the monastery. So she had some rather intelligent and caustic wit at his bridal show that embarrassed him quite badly. He chose her and she shunned him more or less and embarrassed him in front of everyone. So she left the city of Constantinople and found her own monastery to save her life to the west of the city in 843. And she started to write hymns. And most of her musical pieces are what we call in, forgive me if I say wrong, Sikyrion? Sikyrion form. I always say it wrong. Sikyrion form. That means there's long verses that are chanted, the ones that are chanted in the morning offices and orthros in the evening and vespers. There's two types of these. Idomelia, which have their own melody that's not shared by the other verses, and the doxasikon that tells the lives of the saints. So St. Cassia has a lot of doxasikon that are attributed to her. She wrote the ones for St. Mary of Egypt, St. Christiana, St. Eudokia, St. Agatha, St. Barbara, St. Calicia, if I said that right, St. Thecla, and many others. Her famous hymn is the Lament of Mary Magdalene that's chanted for the Orthros of Holy Wednesday that's sung on Tuesday night. She's credited with writing the odes for the Tetrodion of Holy Saturday. She was widely appreciated for their beautiful, her hymns always have the programmatic imagery they talk about. She was the one who could draw a picture for you. That's why we start singing the Holy Tuesday hymn and everyone's sobbing by the end of it because the imagery is so beautiful. 49 of her hymns are still in use by our church today. Only 23 of those have been proven genuinely by scholars to belong to Cassiani. So we think that 49 of them are her, but they're like, we're not sure. But they've actually proven that 23 of them she wrote because she was at a monastery and we have them, and that's pretty a large number if you look at historical documents. The story goes that she was out walking and the emperor showed up to seek her advice and sort of make amends with her later in life, and she didn't want to see him, so she ran off and he found the hymn of Cassiani sitting on her desk, and that's how it became such a famous thing.
Oh, he added some words.
Yeah, of course he did. He was the emperor. Yes.
That's the George Organ story. The story George always told us.
So there's a question about authenticity all the time. Like, was this really attributed to which writer? This is often a problem in all Orthodox hymnography. There was a practice honored in ancient Byzantine times wherein hymnographers, just like iconographers, were reticent to include information about themselves for philosophical reasons. You don't write a hymn so that everybody knows it's you, right? You write a hymn for the glory of God, just like you draw or write an icon. It's not you writing it, right? So they're not signed, which makes it really tough for us to trace who did what. It was believed that spiritual anonymity superseded any earth-given praise. This idea still prevails in some modern monastic communities, which sometimes makes it even difficult for me to identify modern hymnographers who are resetting things, which is really a good thing, I think. But it also makes it hard to trace the breadcrumbs. Unlike Western music where we know who, not only who wrote it, but who their teacher was, right? It's known that female monastics Thecla, Martha, Theodosia, Kuvliklicinia, I say it right, I don't know, and Pelagina wrote liturgical chant. However, we have musical manuscripts of certain authorships only for Cassia and one other hymnographer, and I love this one. She's only known to us as the daughter of Ioannis Kladis, who was a chanter. And she signed it, the daughter of Ioannis Kladis. That's how she signed everything. I know, right?
They used to call us in that the daughter of nothing.
I'm from a small town, they still call me by, are you so-and-so's daughter, right? What little is known of early women hymnographers includes the following information. Thecla, Martha, and Theodosia were all 9th century abbesses, and their music was initially intended just for the women in the monastery to chant. Kuvliklicinia wrote a domesticina, or a direct, she was like a choir director, a domesticina, and the lead chanter for this big female monastery in the 13th century, and it was pretty well renowned. People would go to hear her settings. And then Ioannis Kladis himself was an accomplished chanter in Constantinople. So since his daughter's writing appears in an early 15th century manuscript right alongside his own work, he published it with his, we think that she was either one of his students or might have ran the other chant choir. We're not sure, so we can't tell, but that's our hint that we think women were chanting, otherwise why would he have been teaching his daughter to write? Peleologina, I did not say that right. Peleologina was a hymnographer and a monastic who lived in the 15th century, and she was well educated and related to the imperial family. So we knew this was like a pursuit that people were actually encouraging women to write from the 9th through the 15th century. So in our history of our church, where do the women's choirs come from? Anybody know?
You said from Libya?
You're right. It was the 4th through the 6th century in Syria. They were singing the doctrinal hymns, including the dialogue hymns, which you talk back and forth. There were these dialogue hymns, and they were often hidden behind a screen. So it was like disembodied. No, it was pretty. It was the men were too. It was it was a screen, so it sounded like disembodied voices, like angels coming from behind the screen. So it was supposed to give you a feeling of being in another world. It was very dramatic. So women's choirs became established first in the female monastic communities of Jerusalem after that. So it started in Syria, then went to Jerusalem, and then it kind of spread elsewhere as like the church grew. There was a lot of antiphonal singing in the earliest churches between male and female choirs. There was a refrain that the congregation sang, and I think you'll hear vestiges of that in what we sang tonight. The men's choir would sing something, the women's choir would sing something, and the congregation would sing something. And that's the ideal for Byzantine music, because for church music, you're getting everybody to pray. Just like everybody comes in and lights a candle, and the smoke goes up. Everybody needs to come in and pray. Does that make sense? Okay. The hymns in Syria, I want to tell you a little story because it's interesting. So they wrote these dialogue hymns, and they're historical fiction. They weren't real, but they were based on a Bible story in which the main character was usually a woman conversing with some other character. And the dilemma is always resolved by the female character. So it's interesting in these, that's exactly right. It's interesting in these hymns that this was the role of women, was to resolve dilemmas and to be reasoned. And that was what was being taught to young women in Syria through church hymns. I found that a little fascinating because music tells us as a package what we believe as a group of people and what we're passing on to our kids. So if young women are taught that they're supposed to grow up and learn how to resolve dilemmas and mediate, this is an important thing that's being passed on through music. From the 9th century until now, the stories and viewpoints of women have become archived in the music of the Orthodox Church. That's where all of our history is archived. There's Troparius, there's the Akathis, there's the Kontakion. I literally have a list, and it's on the back of your icon, of all the women's saints whose hymns I quoted. So I sat, I know it's tiny, I'm sorry, it was a bigger chart. I sat for about 3 months and found all the hymns of women's saints I could find. And I found different translations from the Russian and the Greek and the Arabic, and then I coded them for themes. So I went through and I went, okay, this theme occurs how many times? So you'll see on the side there's some themes there. There is an athletic theme that talks about women saints as gladiators. There are plural references. That makes sense, right? The mother of God is a rose, things like that. First person speech is a big deal. Most of the time we talk about things in third person. We tell stories about somebody else, right? We talk about a saint. When you're referring to somebody in first person, you're personifying them and petitioning them to talk to them. So this is that's the big important thing about the Akathis to me, is that we're talking to the Pania specifically. The one I really like is the military reference. There's even a woman who slays dragons. I love that one. Where's some other interesting ones? There's a lot about lamps and beams and rays, that women are reflecting the light of Christ, right? But that's true in hymns about men too, but one I really liked was the non-traditional roles. Look down at the very bottom.
Yeah, that's the one I just was pointing at.
Yeah, women who weren't married, or who lived alone,
There's a ton of them.
or who defied the patriarch, or defied their father, or women who preached, right? These are not quite in along with the system women, and yet they became saints, or perhaps that's why they became saints. I think this is important, and if you look in the bottom column, I put some of the more interesting ones there. I love St. Thecla turned the flames to dew. They burned her and the flames turned to water. And then the one who destroyed the serpent. That's St. Juliana of Nicodemia. Hope I'm saying that right. And there was another one who overcame the animals. That was St. Genevieve, who was in Paris. And she overcame the animals. Like they attacked her on the road and she could overcome them. So these are not wilting lily women that we're singing about in our church. These are empowered women who give good role models to our kids to stand up for Christ, to stand up for yourself, to stand up for the people around you and your family, right? And to help mediate problems. So I am going to skip ahead just a little because I want to talk about the Akathist hymn. So the Akathist hymn has 24 eco-year blocks that form an acrostic of the Greek alphabet. So if you go back to the pretty colored side of the paper. And this is just a gloss. I have a whole chapter on the Lamentations too, and all the stories of weeping women from ancient Greece that we turned into the ideas of weeping in the church. So we took the things from ancient Greece and kept a lot of these musical ideas and used them now for the church instead of for secular ideas. They were just popular music at the time. So if you look at this acrostic of the alphabet, each block gives you a story in the life of the Pania, and I know it's a little blurry, this was awfully hard to get out, and I'm having trouble finding it, but I really would love to order one of these icons if we can find it. It's a little on the big side. But it tells the story of Pania and how she relates to Christ. So each thing we're saying about her is really important. Have you ever listened to some of the things that we say about the Pania during the Akathos? We call her a lot of names. Now you think calling people names is not nice usually. These are very nice names, and they mean something important. Naming is really interesting. Naming comes to us from Africa, which if you think about it, Syria, the liturgical tradition, I think there's a connection here. It's even prevalent in blues music now in America, this idea of naming. In African music traditions, when you name something, you take the power of it into yourself. By calling somebody or someone by their name, there's an intimate relationship and you share something. It's that idea of plugging in again. So in blues music here in the United States, the tradition developed that if somebody was hurting you, you called them out by name and you could take some of the power away from them. This idea is very old and it's also prevalent in the Akathist hymn. We use all these names for the Panagia, like the gate through which none but the word of God is passed. It's a pretty cool name, right? It tells you a lot about her. She's the gate, just like the beautiful gate. There's a lot of meaning in there. She's the gate, she opens the way for us to Christ, right? And yet, none but the word of God is passed. She's not had any other children, it's just Christ. She's a virgin. There's all of that embedded in one little name. And we call her, how many names is it? It's a lot, it's over 100 in just the Akathist hymn of the names we call her. So, the Akathist hymn was written by who? Anybody know? St. Romanos. He wrote that's why I love it so much. He dreamt it. Remember, Pania came to him in a dream, he had to eat the scroll, and it was one of the hymns he dreamt was the Akathist hymn. He was following the footsteps of St. Ephrem the Syrian, whose hymns St. Ephrem the Syrian in Syria had used these hymns to help educate a largely illiterate people about the church. That was the first purpose of the hymns. He wanted to take the scripture and the church readings and teach people through the hymns. So St. Romanos lived from 490 to 556, and he was born to Jewish parents, and he converted to Christianity himself as a young boy. So he drew from the Jewish chant traditions because he heard that growing up. And then he drew from the scriptures after he converted, and so he came up for this idea for these women's choirs in Syria that would teach all of these exciting ideas to people who couldn't read, right? So St. Romanos lived in Beirut later, and then later Constantinople, and the tradition is that he fell asleep in church and that Theotokos appeared and said, here, eat this scroll. And the story says that when he woke up, he went up to the chanter stand, and the boy who before sounded like a squawking bird, right? Now, extemporaneously chanted the entire first Kontakio perfectly. Boom. I would like to have that happen to me. That was really exciting. The long Kontakia hymns contain anywhere from 18 to 30 verses, and they're named for the kontaks. The kontaks was a pole, and they would take this long parchment with all the verses and wind it around the pole, and it would be unwound by the chanter while he sang, so that's why they're called kontakia. The verses are ikoi. Ikoi mean houses in Greek. Do they look like little houses? See? The little pictures?
Iki.
Say it again?
Iki.
Iki. See, I'm getting a Greek lesson.
That's okay.
I need to get back to Greek lessons. Okay. So the verses are called iki, which means houses in Greek. So you have this kontakion, right? And then you have the little houses for each verse. It's a container. It houses the idea you're trying to get across in one verse. In the Akathist hymn, each of the 24 verses begins with the next letter of the Greek alphabet. Some of the hymns are called kathismata. That means you sing them from a seated position. But we call it the Akathist because it's from the standing Akathist position of standing. So this is an honor. We're standing in honor of the Pania. Though Kontakia normally contain acrostics, that's common for them to use an acrostic, they often spell out the author of the hymn signature. That's how we find out sometimes who the hymnographer is. This one is the most complicated example of all the Kontakia acrostics ever. It's the most complicated one. Linguists have looked at it, and puzzle makers, and they can't figure out how they got it all in there. Each verse begins on the next letter of the Greek alphabet, and the smaller scenes are the stories told in each verse. So there's 8 odes in the Akathist hymn, each of which uses a Byzantine hymn tone. The odes contain either 5 or 6 verses, after which we always chant, Most Holy Theotokos, save us, except for the last 2 where we say glory to the Father and both now and ever. It tells us where we are in the progression. It helps us mentally latch on to what's going on so we can follow it, right? That's why it's such a good teaching tool. It helps. And it helps us to embody what's happening, more than if we were to read that. We could read it and go, oh, what a lovely poem. But what happens when you chant it? Does anybody feel this? When you just sit down and read the poem of the Akathist, you might go, this is great. I should have everybody read this. This is lovely. What happens differently when you start to chant it?
More of a prayer.
You're elevated. Like
Yeah.
It becomes alive.
you become alive.
That's the way to put it. It becomes life. You start to feel it. I mean, like, I feel it. Does that ring true to anybody else? So the point is, you should not be standing in the pew just saying the words. You should at least be singing in your head. At the very least, audiating. That's the idea that the sound is in your head. It's sort of like you're smelling the incense, the sound is in your head, and you are putting life, I like that it becomes alive. You're putting life into the piece of poetry that otherwise is just words, right? So we greet the Panagia. So we have the Ti per Maho, the O Champion General, and that's chanted usually loudly by two choirs alternating, and the congregation usually joins in loudly and wholeheartedly. But following this, there's these salutations, and actually it's not always following, it depends on which one we're doing. But, sorry, I keep losing my place on my page. So, forgive me. But the point is that each one of these verses is supposed to say something else. So each one, there's some concluding responses, and it's a solemn hymn, but it's not supposed to be complicated. It's supposed to be us reading the Panagia. So with each one we say, it's not in third person, we're greeting her. So it's this idea of the hymns help us approach God. Does that sound? That through the process of praying, it helps us to approach God. I'm going to skip ahead. I have lots of this if anybody's really interested. I can give you way too much information written out and published about all of this stuff. Lamentations, hymns of the wailing women, the idea that women wailed at funerals in ancient Greece, and we took that idea and put it into Lamentations. I've got all of the text of these coded out. If you're interested in a particular saint, let me know. But the one thing I want to make sure I say, this is why I'm kind of skipping, is I want to read something to you that I wrote about the purpose, for me, of the dialogue of the hymn. That it's not singing in church. I don't care if you call it chanting or singing, it's the same thing to me. But it's not a one-way conversation. It's a dialogue. To talk about music, this is a little bit of I study sociology a lot of music, so to talk about music is not only to discuss the aesthetic qualities of music, but it's to consider how music structures us as individuals within a social group. And to examine how music helps us teach individuals what they need to know in order to move into and within a culture and a society as a member of that group. So in our case, the culture is the church. And how do we as individuals move within the church and help ourselves to grow? And how do we grow in our relationship to Christ? And how do we grow in our relationship to one another? And all of that happens through many things. But one of the things that really facilitates it is hymnography. Music is a way in which society can put its issues into discussion between those who chant and sing and those who participate and sing along and listen. This allows the members of a community to engage in a dialogue which either challenges or supports and affirms the existing cultural norms. So we have something we believe, and so we sing about it, and we can talk about it. It brings it up. Do we really believe this? Are we challenging it? Are we affirming it? What are we saying? In the case of Byzantine music, the hymns concerning women, for example, allow a woman in the community to affirm her own identity and resonate her own experience in her world of the church. And that's true for men too. I'm just using that as an example because we don't think of that very often. As a pedagogical musical tool, the Akathist hymn connects community members to historical events in the community's past. Right? Ti per Maho. What does that make you think of? Byzantium. They walked out, the soldiers walked out, and they held up the icon of Panagia, and the city was saying, we're connecting to a historical past. It allows traditions from different regions of Greece to coexist in America. That was important in creating cohesive communities in the Greek American diaspora here. Byzantine chant in the Greek Orthodox churches in America functions politically, socially, spiritually, and affectively. It affects us. It helps us establish our ideals. We look at Christ as the ideal. A lot of women look at Panagia as the ideal model to follow. And the more we know about her and the attributes of her, those help us say, oh, as a young woman, that's an ideal I should follow. I want to be this way. Through historical precedent, the voice of women is heard clearly in Byzantine chant, It provides models that people can latch onto. How many of you have a favorite saint that you're like, that's me? Like, I want to be like that. This person seems a lot like me, and I wish I could get there. Does anybody feel that way? I mean, I have Saint Thecla sitting up on top of my mantle at home. I take it everywhere. Thecla. I love Saint Thecla. But the idea is, I don't know, everybody has one or two, right? This idea of latching onto, it's the hymns to me. That's how it gets me to latch onto it. So when we portray people in music, they become prototypes, images to follow. And just seeing that image and just reading the story of their life is one thing. But when you have a hymn you can chant to them, it becomes part of your own body. You move. Even if we don't think we're moving, we're moving. We stand and chant, we're looking at each other, we're making micro movements that are like imperceptible. Our eyebrows, our hands, the way we just exchange ideas with each other. We look across, right? We look up at the icons. You know, I talk to the kids and they say, we have to sing all the way to Panagia because they're too quiet. I said, she can't hear you. Sing, you know, those ideas of singing, that's what we're learning. It's not the music itself. It's not about the aesthetic, and it's not about being perfect. So each saint that we look at represents a combination: ethnic group, age, lifestyle, social status. These are all linked, all the women saints at least are linked to the idea of how much like the Theotokos they are, quite often in hymns, or how they emulate certain qualities. So if you come from a particular ethnic group, or you're a particular age in your life, and you find a saint to identify with, the hymn helps you latch onto them. And it can teach people how to act in the community. This is the way we should behave. The Akathist hymn portrays femininity in what I think is a validating way. It's not a wimpy, soft way. It's a very validating and affirming role. The virtues the hymn ascribes to women in the person Theotokos then become taught and embedded in part of our communities. And how we treat women, how we defer to mothers with honor, for example, comes from this idea. Mary's exemplified as a protector. She's an activist. When she's called the stole, I love this, she's called the stole of those without rights and the voice of the voiceless. That's an activist to me, right? That's an exact hymn, two hymn quotes from that hymn, and the Activist hymn. And her prototype exalts her intelligence. It calls her the bridge between the spiritual and the mundane. She's the bridge, promoting both her military and her healing powers. We don't often think of women as being military and healing. That's just not a common Western concept. But doesn't that make sense in terms of how we think about the world in the Orthodox Church and how we think about our mothers could do anything, you know, that sort of idea? The popularity of these services, the antiphonal nature of the hymn's construction allows for people, all people to participate in the service. And there's a lot of intergenerational connections with this service because a lot of people, like I said, told me that they went with Yaya to hear this and that's what they would hear. All hymns are social connectors. I actually have to throw this in. So I feel like I call it the Akathist, I think it's like the ultimate love song to a woman. It shows trust, respect, deference, admiration, and awe to someone who serves in the role of a mother. This is not something that I think is honored in the Western worldview in the way that we honor it. And I think that's important. The Akathist hymn asks the Mother of God, by what name should I call you? By what name shall I call thee? Though the hymn never answers that rhetorical question directly, that's kind of the point. It's a thesis. It asks a question and then doesn't answer it. It lets you answer it for yourself. It never answers it directly, but the answer is implicit in each of the hymns, which answer this question with a continuous outpouring of translations, transcriptions, and recitations of this ancient music. So each time we say it, we're trying to answer it anew. If it gave us the answer, we'd know the answer. But if we have to keep singing it, we're looking for more answers. And it's an ever ongoing journey of how we get closer to being as close as the Mother of God is to Christ. We're never going to get there, but that's our goal, right? So if that's our goal, to be as close as Panagia is to Christ, then each time we chant about her, we can get a little closer. We keep answering the question. So in this way, this is just one example, I have others. And with this way, music, Byzantine music in the Orthodox Church tradition, allows members of the community to conceive of music in relevant ways and meaningfully engage in a dialogue with members of the church, not just present, but in the past. We have the choir of the saints around us. I dedicated this thesis to a very good friend of mine. I will try not to cry. Mr. Athanasopoulos, this is my last story and then I'll close, would not let me chant. When I first went to a church in Chicago, women couldn't chant. I said, okay, can you teach me to chant? No. This went on for 3 months. Finally, I went up and just stood behind him down the edge of the platform from the psaltery, and I just stood there, and I just started absorbing. It was really nice to be outside of church, but no, he wouldn't teach me to chant. And then one Sunday, I was the only one there, besides him, and his eyesight was failing, he called me up to chant. So I chanted with him for like 3 years after that. And he used to thump me in the head. I think I've told this story before to a few people. He would literally go thump and thump me in the head. Every time I make a mistake, he would say, we're in the middle of church, we're just chanting along, he'd thump me in the head. It was like Pavlov training his dogs. I was learning not to make mistakes, right? Here's the point. The priest would come out and he'd say, you can't hit her, she a girl. He's like, and he said in Greek, she's not a girl, she's a chanter. He's like, you're no longer a girl or a boy, you're just chanting, just do your job, get it right. And to me, that was important. I dedicated this to him, because to this day, if there's a hymn I can't recall, I often hear the echo of him singing in my ears. He was 89, he's been passed for almost 10 years. And posthumously we got him an award because he translated 3 works of Byzantine music theory in English for me, because I begged and begged and begged. So we got him the St. Romanos Medal. His son and I did it posthumously for him. But he was wonderful, and to this day I hear his voice in my ears when I chant, which is good because his daughter and his son are both tone deaf, so he was really gonna die with me. So I was like, you gotta teach me, it's really funny. So the end, I hope you have questions for me. Dennis.